Melina Harper had never imagined her life would lead here. At 47, after nearly 2 decades of managing quality control labs for a major food conglomerate, she walked away. Not out of burnout, not in some fit of spiritual awakening, but with the kind of sharp, calculated decisiveness that had always defined her. Years of sterile offices, HR meetings, supply chain chaos, and passive-aggressive internal politics had hardened her into someone who didn't blink when something had to be done, but it also left her tired in a way that no vacation or therapist could fix. Her aunt's passing came at a strange time, one of those oddly symbolic closures the universe occasionally throws into a person's path. With it came the inheritance, a 2-hectare farm on the rural edge of Walker County, Georgia, tucked far enough from the main roads that silence wasn't something you scheduled, it was simply there. Layered thick between the rustling trees and the rhythmic cluck of the 3 hens still roaming the coop like centuries of a forgotten time. She didn't come here to reinvent herself. Melina wasn't interested in farming as a lifestyle brand or a curated Instagram fantasy with mason jars and sun hats. She came to rebuild something that had mattered to someone she loved: her aunt's land, her routines, her solitude. It was about structure, about effort, about anchoring herself in something that was completely her own and immune to boardroom votes or corporate slogans. The land didn't care about your resume, and that suited her just fine. The farm itself was simple, an old timber-framed house with a wraparound porch that creaked just enough to make it feel alive. A greenhouse her aunt had built herself with polycarbonate panels patched here and there with duct tape, a well with clean, cold water drawn through decades-old piping, and a single, aging Appaloosa horse named Marge. Melina didn't care much for horses before. Marge changed that. The animal wasn't affectionate, but she was honest. She let you know when something was wrong, kicked the fence if she was hungry, snorted like a war drum when a coyote passed too close. They stared silently at you when you were screwing something up. They had an understanding now, mutual respect. Those early months were hard but satisfying. Melina handled everything herself, not because she had a chip on her shoulder, but because she didn't trust half measures. Fences were mended, gutters cleared, soil tested. The septic tank was a nightmare, but she had it pumped and documented. The tax office updated her ownership, the utilities transferred, the land surveyed and notarized. When she worked, she worked. When she rested, she didn't waste it with guilt. There were no social obligations, no mandatory potlucks or wellness sessions with HR consultants. Just tasks, outcomes, and the breathing space between them. People in the county were polite, mostly. A few offered to help with tools or local contacts. Others, especially from the nearby development, gave her the look, curious, slightly condescending, like a tourist who had wandered off the map. She didn't care. She didn't host barbecues, didn't ask to borrow sugar, didn't insert herself into the little ecosystems of the neighborhood watch or the monthly community breakfasts. She paid what was due, kept her property in order, waved when appropriate, and went back to work. It was only when she noticed the plastic flags along her western boundary line that something felt off. She'd been trimming dead branches from a row of pecans near the border, her gloves caked in resin, when the bright orange caught her eye. Not wildlife markers. Not hunting tape. These were surveyors' flags, freshly placed, evenly spaced, and leading in a straight line right through her irrigation trench. At first she assumed it was a mistake. Maybe utility maintenance, maybe something for the road crew clearing brush on the main access lane last week. But then she saw the stake driven into the dirt near her main gate, the laminated tag attached with plastic zip ties flapping in the breeze. It was printed cleanly, professionally, with a logo in the top corner, Walker County Community Association. Beneath that, bold text in all caps, preliminary inspection zone, do not remove. Environmental review pending. Melina pulled off her gloves and crouched beside the marker. There was no phone number, no contact info, no reference number, just a bureaucratic warning and an empty logo. Her stomach tightened, not in fear, but in that slow, cold way a person feels when something is starting and they don't yet know the shape of it. She wasn't part of any association. The property, as outlined in the deed in the original zoning documents from 1974, was outside the borders of the subdivision. Her aunt had made sure of that. Melina had the papers to prove it, kept in a weather-sealed envelope inside her home safe. There had been no meetings, no announcements, no votes. No one knocked on her door or left a letter in her mailbox. She had received no registered mail, no notices stapled to the fence post. This wasn't an invitation. It was a declaration, quiet, sterile, and preemptive. By evening, she had walked the perimeter and counted 9 markers, in total 2 along the road, 3 deep along the wooded backstretch, and 4 near the vegetable rows where she'd just laid irrigation lines. The precision disturbed her. Whoever had placed them knew the layout. He knew what mattered. That night, as she sat on the porch with a cup of black coffee going lukewarm in her hand, she didn't pace or rant or search the internet for HOA horror stories. She reviewed her documents again, checked the seal, the signatures, the boundary lines drawn in thick archival ink. She printed off fresh copies and highlighted every relevant clause. Then she loaded her printer with a new cartridge, typed out a letter of formal non-consent to any unauthorized entry or modification of her property, and posted it by the gate the next morning, laminated and zip-tied to the post where their stake had been. She left the flag in the ground. Let them see it. Nothing happened for 2 days. Then her mailbox held a new envelope, no stamp, no return address, just folded and sealed like an inter-office memo. Inside, a printed notice on heavy cream paper with the same logo and an opening line that made her jaw tighten. Dear property occupant, as part of the Walker County Community Sustainability Initiative, we are reviewing the compliance of extended parcels for alignment with current ecological and infrastructure codes. Your property has been identified as pending integration under Section 13 billion. Integration. It wasn't just about inspections, it was about absorption. Melina didn't flinch. She didn't call friends or post on Facebook. She took the letter, added it to her folder, and went back to her work. But she checked the locks on the tool shed twice that night, and she let Marge roam closer to the porch, untethered. This wasn't over. It hadn't even started. Melina didn't have to wait long to find out exactly how far the association was willing to go. 3 days after she posted her formal refusal at the gate, a man appeared at her front steps just before noon. He didn't knock. Instead, he stood with his back to the house, hands clasped behind him like he was waiting for a bus, gazing out across the pasture as if it already belonged to him. She spotted him from the greenhouse and approached carefully, gloves still on, her boots caked in mud. He didn't turn around even when she stopped 5 feet behind him. She cleared her throat. He turned slowly, deliberately, like someone used to being obeyed before being acknowledged. He was tall, dressed too neatly for the weather-creased khakis, pale blue button-up, expensive sunglasses that hid the direction of his gaze. "I'm Dan Barlow," he said, extending his hand, chairman of the Community Oversight Board. Melina didn't take his hand. She didn't answer right away either. He smiled like that didn't matter. "I was in the area. Thought I'd introduce myself formally. Some of our staff mentioned your letter. The impressive command of statutory language, I must say." Melina didn't return the smile. She nodded once and said, "This land isn't part of your community. I've made that clear in writing. If you have questions about jurisdiction, my lawyer's contact is listed at the bottom of the notice." Barlow laughed softly, the kind of chuckle men use when they think they're disarming a tense room. "Oh, Melina, may I call you Melina? This isn't adversarial. At least not yet. What we're dealing with is a matter of shared interest." See, the board passed a resolution to expand the governance boundary earlier this year. That resolution passed with majority vote. As allowed under the 2002 Regional Development Charter, your property, this lovely stretch of it, happens to fall within the area designated for review. Melina crossed her arms. "And, well, And Barlow continued, taking a slow step closer, we're implementing new guidelines for sustainability, community health, and development standardization. These changes are in the long-term interest of all stakeholders: infrastructure cohesion, environmental impact mitigation, visual harmony. Melina didn't move. Sounds like you want control. My answer's the same. This land is not for integration. Barlow smiled again, wider now, the smile of someone who enjoys being resisted. I'm afraid the resolution has already been filed. You should have received the preliminary documents. It's all part of the process. Of course, there will be adjustment periods, and we're happy to work with you on compliance timelines. Most transitions go smoothly. No need to make things difficult. Melina stared at him for a long beat, then said, "Leave." Barlow's smile never broke, but the warmth vanished from his voice. Melina, refusal to comply opens the door to procedural enforcement. Fines, access suspensions, infrastructure review. It gets complicated fast. I'd rather not go down that road. She took a step forward, firm and slow, boots crunching dry soil. This is private property. You weren't invited. You are now trespassing. I won't say it again. He studied her face for a few moments. Then he removed his sunglasses and folded them with unnecessary care. His eyes were pale gray, cold, almost bored. We'll be in touch. He walked down the porch steps with the grace of someone who expected things to follow behind him. He didn't glance back. When he reached the gate, he paused, tore down the laminated notice she had zip-tied to the post, and tucked it into his leather folder before getting into a charcoal gray SUV. She stood there until the dust settled. Then she went inside and locked the door, not because she was scared, but because she had work to do. The following morning, she received a packet in the mail, this time with tracking and signature confirmation. Inside, a formal statement of preliminary violation. 4 pages. Section 13 billion infraction, failure to adhere to initial environmental readiness code. Attached photos showed her greenhouse, her water tank, and disturbingly her private well, capped and clearly marked. They had been taken from inside the property, beyond the gate. No warrant. No appointment. No notice. She called her lawyer immediately. Susan Rhymes had dealt with similar cases before: property boundary disputes, rogue enforcement actions, utility zone reclassification. She was blunt, efficient, and not easily shaken, but even she took a beat when Melina described the visit and the photos. They're trying to escalate fast, Susan said. They want to force you into reactive mode, burn your time and money. This packet is posturing. But the presence on your land, that's criminal trespass. Do you have footage? Not from that angle, Melina admitted. The Westfield camera was off for maintenance. Then document everything. I mean everything. Start a journal. Time, dates, weather, vehicles, people, sounds, even if it seems minor. We'll draft a cease and desist, and I'll contact the board's legal rep directly. They'll back off once they see you're not soft. Melina did exactly that. She recorded the tire marks near the water tank. She took photos of the gate post where the zip tie had been cut. She checked the well cap for tampering. Nothing seemed physically damaged, but the intrusion was precise, almost surgical enough to provoke, not enough to prosecute. 2 days later, her internet cut out. The provider claimed a line issue scheduled maintenance. Except the notice of that maintenance came 12 hours after the service had already failed. The power flickered twice that week, only for a few minutes, but always around 2 a.m. Her order of organic feed from the co-op was delayed due to a routing error. Minor things, small glitches, but they added up. On the 5th day, a second letter arrived, this one less formal. No legal language. Just a note, unsigned, typed on plain paper. Continued non-compliance will trigger enforcement evaluation. Cooperation is safer and more productive for everyone. The word safer was underlined. Nothing else. Melina read it twice. Then she folded it slowly, placed it in a folder labeled harassment, and tucked it into the drawer beside her desk. She made no calls. She didn't speak to her neighbors. She didn't post online. Instead, she walked the fence line at dusk and reinforced the latches on every gate. She swept the property by flashlight after midnight, slow and thorough. When the generator hiccuped the next morning, she was already checking the diesel levels before the sun crested the trees. Nothing had been done by accident. Every piece was measured, paced, calculated to induce uncertainty. Barlow wasn't sending random messages, he was drawing a map. A pressure map. Testing thresholds. Watching how far she'd go before folding. Melina had no intention of folding. But she understood the game now. It wasn't about bylaws or votes. It was about attrition. Not a war of conquest, but of erosion. Let enough little things shake a person's foundation, and eventually they'll volunteer to be taken. She knew better. And she knew it was only just beginning. The rain came hard that night, unseasonal and aggressive, as if the storm itself had been waiting for the perfect moment to unleash. Melina lay in bed, listening to it hammer the roof, the wind clawing at the eaves like impatient fingers. She didn't sleep much anymore. Not because of fear, she didn't give fear that kind of power, but because her body had adjusted to vigilance, and vigilance didn't believe in rest. When she finally stepped outside just before dawn, the air was thick and wet, the sky the color of spoiled milk. Mud sucked at her boots as she moved through the field to check the drainage ditches. One of the gates, an old aluminum one near the back pasture, was hanging crooked on its hinges. The screws had been loosened deliberately. The gate was bent inward, not outward, and fresh tracks ran across the saturated grass, too narrow for a car, too deep for a deer. She followed them for 20 yards before they disappeared into a patch of gravel she hadn't laid. Someone had been here. Again. And this time they hadn't cared about hiding it. That afternoon she received a visit from two men in matching windbreakers bearing the same logo she'd seen on the previous letters. They claimed to be from the Unified Environmental Enforcement Unit, a department she knew for a fact had no jurisdiction in unincorporated zones like hers. Still, they carried clipboards and ID badges that looked just official enough to convince someone less prepared. They asked to inspect her greenhouse for water runoff compliance. Melina refused. They asked again, this time framing it as a cooperative courtesy check. She informed them they were trespassing and gave them 15 seconds to leave. One of them muttered something under his breath, and she locked the gate behind them with the practiced ease of someone used to securing what was hers. 5 minutes later, she called Susan and described the encounter. Susan was already on her way to the clerk's office with a motion to file a restraining order against further unauthorized visits. They're pushing now, she said, trying to trigger you into a mistake. Don't give them one. But mistakes had already begun to accumulate, though none of them were hers. That evening, Melina discovered her irrigation controller had been tampered with. Not broken, not vandalized, just subtly altered. The timing had been adjusted, resulting in a flood around her southern fence where she stored compost and runoff collection tanks. The water had pooled overnight and eaten through the soft underlayer of earth. One of the tanks had collapsed into the soggy ground, releasing a pungent slurry that reeked of rot and ammonia. She spent 2 hours in the dark dragging it upright with ropes and a winch, soaking through her jeans and cutting her hands on the rusted edges. She didn't call anyone. She didn't scream. She cleaned, repaired, documented, and moved on. The next morning brought an envelope slid beneath her door, no postage, no address, just a sealed packet with a photocopy of a newly filed petition. The community board, under Barlow's direction, was requesting a formal reassessment of her land's zoning status under county ordinance revisions. Melina had anticipated something like this, but not so quickly, and not with such procedural veneer. Attached were signatures, 15 in total, from property owners in the neighboring development. Several names she recognized, if only vaguely, from brief waves or side glances at the market or hardware store. The implication was clear. The board was positioning her land as problematic, her presence as a threat to communal order. Their language was careful, clinical, filled with phrases like incompatibility of adjacent land use, risk of unmanaged utility overflow, in structural disharmony with projected eco-growth corridors. It was bureaucratic poetry, meaningless to the untrained eye but loaded with potential consequence. Susan reviewed the petition and said, flatly, they're laying the groundwork to force integration. If they get enough support, they'll claim necessity, and the county might buy it. We need a counteraction, a preemptive land use certification. You have the records? Melina handed over the folder she'd updated: weekly deed, topographic surveys, utility logs, well certifications, historical exemptions. Susan nodded. Good, but keep logging everything. If they step out of bounds, I need it ready. 2 days later, her fencing contractor called to cancel. Sorry, Ma, I am, the voice said. We've been advised not to proceed with any installations that haven't gone through compliance verification. When she asked who had advised them, the man paused and said, I can't say. But I'd really appreciate if you didn't push me on this. The call ended. She wasn't surprised. That same day, her delivery of livestock feed was delayed again, and when it finally arrived, 3 bags had been slit open at the bottom, spilling oats and pellet dust all over the truck bed. The driver shrugged and said, must have happened in transit, before speeding off without a receipt. Then came the property tax anomaly. Melina opened a letter from the county and found a statement indicating a pending reassessment of her property's tax classification. A small note at the bottom easily overlooked claimed the reassessment was prompted by a zoning irregularity flagged by community petition. Her rate wasn't changing yet, but the footnote read like a threat, a hint of what's to come if she didn't play along. Susan was furious. They're trying to squeeze you out by making the land too expensive to keep. This is straight-up economic coercion. Melina didn't respond. She was standing at the window, watching a slow-moving pickup idle just beyond her gate. It didn't turn in. Didn't flash lights. Just sat there, engine running, driver masked behind sun glare and tinted glass. She watched it for 10 minutes before it finally pulled away. She made a note in her logbook. She marked the time, direction, vehicle color, and approximate speed. She drew a small X on the map taped beside her kitchen table. That night, Marge the Appaloosa refused to approach the feed trough. When Melina investigated, she found the trough filled with fresh water, but a faint smell of something chemical clung to it, acrid and unnatural. She dumped it immediately and checked the cistern. No sign of tampering, but she switched to bottled water for the next few days, just in case. It was the morning after that when Melina saw the sign. Planted at the edge of her property, just outside the gate, was a steel placard, professionally mounted into the ground. It bore the logo of the board, the same emblem from the first laminated marker, now rendered in reflective paint. The text beneath it read, "Pending transition zone, compliance required. The external oversight authority engaged." It wasn't subtle. It was a declaration of occupation. Melina stood before it for a long time. Then she turned back inside, sat at her desk, and wrote 3 letters. The first to Susan, listing every incident of the past 2 weeks in excruciating detail. The second to the county's Land Oversight Committee, formally requesting an investigation into unlawful harassment, procedural misconduct, and boundary encroachment. The third to the sheriff's office, factual, unemotional, and legally sound reporting trespassing, unauthorized inspections, and intimidation. The following day, a patrol car came by. The deputy was polite, distant, clearly uncomfortable. He took her statement, nodded a lot, and promised to file the report. He didn't write anything down. She offered her own copy. He took it without reading and folded it into his clipboard. Before leaving, he said, "You should talk to someone at the board, work it out directly. These things escalate fast." Melina thanked him and closed the door behind him. She stood there, motionless, until the sound of his tires faded. Then she locked the bolt and moved to the back of the house, where she opened the gun safe and checked the action on her 12 gauge. She didn't believe in dramatics. She didn't like ultimatums. But there were lines, and someone had decided to find out where hers were. They were about to learn that she hadn't moved here to be owned. And she damn sure hadn't come here to be pushed. By the time the county's response arrived, Melina was already beyond the point of expecting fairness. It came in the form of a thin envelope with an impersonal return address and language so carefully crafted it practically admitted guilt by its own overcalibration. The review board had acknowledged receipt of concerns and was in the process of internal assessment. No reference to the harassment, the trespassing, or the attempted reclassification of her land, just a quiet promise of bureaucracy to come, smothered in passive voice. She read the letter twice, placed it into the folder marked county, and didn't bother reacting. The game wasn't being played above board. That much was clear, and no letter was going to realign what had already gone sideways. The following morning, she received an email from Susan with the subject line, "Got a bite." One of the junior auditors at the County Land Commission had flagged irregularities in the zoning filings associated with her property. According to the records, an amended environmental jurisdiction map had been quietly filed 2 months earlier by the community board, after classifying her land into a new interconnected stewardship district. The problem was, the map had never been approved by the necessary oversight bodies. It had simply been attached to a batch of unrelated municipal filings and logged as passed. Not debated. Not even read. Just quietly absorbed into the system through procedural camouflage. Susan's tone was sharper now, her messages less theoretical. This wasn't sloppiness, she wrote. This was structured fraud. They're creating legal precedent through inaction. And if we don't hit back fast, they'll bury us in the dust of their own fake paper trail. Melina forwarded the email to 3 different agencies, copied her complaint log to the State Land Use Ombudsman, and spent the rest of the day compiling everything into a compressed folder she hand-delivered to the local news desk, even though she doubted it would lead to anything. The editor had nodded, listened with professional patience, then said, "We're a bit cautious with this kind of coverage, MS. Harper. There's a process we have to follow. We'll be in touch." She hadn't heard from them since. That night the rain returned. Short, hard bursts that seemed to strike with intention. Melina sat by the window, not reading, not moving, just watching the tree line sway beneath each gust. Then, at precisely 2:46 a.m., her floodlight clicked on. It wasn't the motion sensor she had disabled that after the last false trigger. This time it was activated manually, someone using the override panel behind the barn. She reached for her boots without making a sound, grabbed the flashlight and the crowbar she kept beneath the side table, and stepped into the darkness. The ground was slick and cold beneath her soles, the scent of wet cedar thick in her nose. She moved fast and silent, years of controlled motion from lab work repurposed into something more primal. No flashlight. No phone. Just memory and instinct. She reached the barn's edge and froze. A low click cut through the rain, the unmistakable sound of a gate unlatching. Then came the scuff of boots on gravel. 2 figures. Not talking. Coordinated, efficient. One crouched near the well, the other remained upright, back to the road, scanning the area with a small handheld light fitted with a red filter. Professional. Not kids. Not neighbors. She stepped back slowly, inch by inch, rounded the side of the barn and reached the breaker box. The main floodlight control was inside. She flipped the switch. Light exploded across the field like a slap. Both men froze. The one by the well stood upright, shielding his face. The other turned toward the barn and Melina saw the patch on his jacket, the same stylized emblem that had been stamped on every letter, every notice, every threat. Without thinking, she stepped forward, crowbar in hand, and shouted, "You're trespassing. Law enforcement's been notified. Move now or you'll be photographed and prosecuted." The upright one flinched. The other bolted, slipping in the mud but keeping balance. They didn't speak. Didn't explain. Just ran, fast and quiet, disappearing into the thicket beyond the fence before she could even aim the flashlight. She didn't follow. She didn't need to. They'd shown their hand. The physical intrusion was no longer just symbolic, it was operational. They were probing for vulnerabilities, preparing for something. The next morning, she called Susan. By midday, a private investigator had been assigned to her case not for surveillance, but for documentation and verification. She didn't want revenge. She wanted admissibility. And it was that same afternoon, while reviewing her perimeter with the PI, that she found the new marker. Unlike the earlier plastic flags, this one was metal, laser-etched, and mounted at a 45-degree angle into a stone slab buried just below the moss line. It read, Sector Designate 4C, Water Use Regulation pending final acquisition. Beneath that, a QR code. No signature. No agency. Just a future already assumed, printed in stainless steel. Melina didn't speak for a long time. The investigator, a man named Carlin, who had seen enough ugly land cases to know when not to comment, simply photographed it, logged the GPS coordinates, and moved on to the next quadrant. That night, for the first time in weeks, Melina allowed herself a single drink, no dramatics, just a short, neat bourbon, and stared at the maps covering her kitchen table. They weren't theoretical anymore. They weren't speculative threats or misplaced bureaucracy. They were plans, active, methodical, and executed by people who didn't need her cooperation to proceed. The storm wasn't coming. It had already started. She was just now seeing the shape of it. Melina didn't wake to noise. She woke to silence, the kind that feels too even, too measured, the kind that tells you something's watching. There were no insects humming near the windows, no wind nudging the branches outside, not even the distant barking of the stray dog that sometimes wandered the nearby tree line. Just a stillness so unnatural it rang in her skull like a siren. She sat up slowly, her eyes already searching the dim corners of the bedroom for movement or shadows that didn't belong. The power was still on, but the backup motion sensor monitor at the foot of the bed showed something blinking, 3 external trips. Zone 2. Back fence, no movement afterward. That was more worrying than activity. Whoever had come knew how not to be seen twice. She pulled on jeans, a flannel shirt, and boots in practiced silence, slipped the safety off the shotgun by the door, and made her way out across the gravel. No flashlight. Her eyes were used to the dark now. She moved carefully along the fence line, noting where the ground was disturbed. A footprint, half smeared in wet soil. Part of a cigarette butt wedged into a crevice near the far post. No fence damage. No cut wire. But the metal marker, the one she and Carlin had photographed days earlier, was gone. Removed without a trace. Even the stone slab had been pried loose. They hadn't left a mess. They had left a message: we can come and go as we please. This isn't yours anymore. By sunrise, she had already filed another report with the sheriff's department, her 6th in 3 weeks. The deputy who answered sounded different this time. Vague, politely evasive. We'll review the file and get back to you, he said, which she'd learned by now meant nothing would happen unless she pushed, and even then, the wheels would spin in place. When she mentioned the marker's removal, he didn't even ask follow-up questions. Just logged it and hung up with a dry, disinterested goodbye. The next day, her legal counsel received a formal letter from the board's legal representative, a cease and desist order, accusing Melina of obstructing community development assessments, removing legally placed infrastructure, and issuing verbal threats against licensed personnel acting in official capacity. It was absurd. The wording was theatrical and vague, as if crafted to irritate without any hope of holding in court. Susan assured her it was a bluff, more pressure. But even a bluff creates weight when it's added to a pile that keeps growing by the day. Now Melina was being accused of aggression, not just defiance. They were changing the narrative, casting her not as a victim of encroachment, but as an unstable, unreasonable resistor who posed a threat to the public order. 3 days after that letter, she received a surprise inspection from the state agricultural board. Not local, not regional, state level. They claimed to be following up on an anonymous report alleging unsanitary practices and improper chemical storage on her land. The agents were polite but persistent. They had official documentation, stamped and validated, and Melina, despite every nerve screaming in protest, let them through, escorted them personally, and documented their entire visit herself with a body cam she had started wearing 2 weeks ago. They found nothing. No violations. No hazards. But when she asked if she would receive a written clearance report, the lead agent hesitated and said, "It depends on the complaint resolution process. There's a protocol." "Which means?" she asked flatly. He didn't answer, just thanked her and left. That night, her power went out. The breaker was fine, the fuse box untouched. She switched to the generator, only to find its starter cable cut halfway through, just enough to slip when tension was applied. Sabotage with patience. She rewired the panel herself in the dark, fingers raw and covered in grease, and kept the lights low until morning. At 6:15 a.m., a truck from the County Utility Authority pulled up to the gate and announced they were performing a routine maintenance inspection. She refused entry. They left without resistance. But when she checked the outer pole near the main road, she found a sticker slapped onto the junction box, "Service subject to evaluation." Another subtle thread in a tightening noose. Then came the official citation, delivered by courier, sealed with county tape. The charge, unauthorized land use modification. The source, a civilian observer report. The fine, $3,200, payable within 30 days to avoid legal escalation. Susan was already on it, drafting a motion to appeal and filing a demand for hearing, but the sum wasn't the point. It was the documentation. The board was building a portfolio one where Melina Harper was no longer a private landowner defending her rights, but a repeat violator ignoring community integration guidelines and environmental compliance standards. A profile that could justify forced intervention, zoning override, even eminent domain claims if they played the right political strings. And they were playing them fast. The breaking point came not with another notice or letter, but with sound midnight 2 nights later, a low mechanical hum that didn't belong to anything on her property. She stepped onto the porch and saw it, a drone, sleek and silent, hovering 30 feet above her greenhouse, its red recording light blinking like a heartbeat. She followed it with her eyes as it moved, slow and deliberate, scanning, recording. She aimed her spotlight at it, and it rose higher, out of reach, then zipped away with an artificial shriek of acceleration. She called it in. No response. She checked with FAA drone guidelines. No filing, no permission request, no registered flight pattern in her area. It had come unauthorized, and whoever sent it knew no one would stop them. The next morning, tire tracks curled along the southern edge of her pasture. Not from a car. From an ATV, thin, deep grooves ending at the far end of the tree line, where someone had dumped a pile of animal remains. Bones, half a deer carcass, flies already swarming. It wasn't a warning. It was bait for predators, meant to draw coyotes, or worse, to her property. She buried what she could, poured lime over the rest, and fenced the area off with barbed wire. But the implication was sharp. You're not safe, not even from what nature brings when we leave the gate open long enough. Susan began pushing hard now, contacting oversight boards, requesting injunctions, demanding public hearings. But hearings take time. Processes drag. And the board used every day of delay like a weapon. Every silence became their opportunity. Every waiting period gave them room to press harder. Her case was now on a trajectory, one that could take weeks, even months to resolve. But the people behind the pressure weren't planning to wait that long. They were banking on exhaustion, not evidence. And Melina felt it. In her bones, in her breath. The accumulated wear of every call, every file, every hour spent documenting, fighting, fortifying. She hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night in weeks. Her voice had gone hoarse from phone battles. Her back ached from checking fence posts. Her hands chafed from handling tools she used more often now than she ever had when she first arrived. Her world had become a closed loop of defense, vigilance, and resistance. She wasn't living. She was enduring. But she didn't bend. She didn't snap. She adjusted. And that's what made her dangerous. Because now it wasn't about what they were doing, it was about what they were assuming. That she'd cave. That she'd flee. That one woman, alone on her land, couldn't outlast a committee of suits and silence and lawyers and forms. They were wrong. And she was going to prove it. Not with noise. Not with threats. With the one thing they didn't understand, resilience sharpened into strategy. It began, as so many endings do, not with an explosion but with quiet formality, the arrival of a certified letter in a beige envelope and delivered by a man in a county vehicle who refused to make eye contact. Inside, printed on thick paper with embossed headers, was a formal notification, preliminary order of temporary access for environmental site control. The language was bland but exact. Effective immediately, Melina's property was designated as a subject of regulatory intervention. The notice cited safety concerns, ongoing compliance investigations, and the protection of adjacent communities. Nowhere did it mention her by name. Nowhere did it cite any specific violation. Just clauses. Numbers. Paragraphs stacked like bricks around a verdict that had already been rendered in someone else's boardroom. She read it once, twice, and then a third time with growing clarity. This wasn't a request. It was a statement of possession. They were coming. She called Susan before the envelope hit the desk. Her voice was tight but calm. Susan didn't hesitate. "You're not alone in this," she said. "You're not crazy. This is coordinated. It's time to go higher." That same day, Susan filed an emergency injunction with the state court, not the local circuit, not the county appeal board, but the upper level where political theater still had to pretend to respect law. It was a long shot, she admitted, but it was the only path left. Then she made a second call, not to a judge, not to the press, but to a regional land rights watchdog organization. They weren't exactly well known, but they had teeth. Quiet ones. The kind of group that didn't tweet slogans or march in streets but knew how to trace money, pressure municipal councils, and file lawsuits with precision-engineered fury. Within 48 hours, they'd assigned 2 researchers to her case, one specializing in zoning irregularities, the other in regulatory overreach. It wasn't a cavalry charge, but it was something better: methodical, unemotional, deeply competent resistance. Meanwhile, Melina prepared. Not for violence, she wasn't fantasizing about standoffs, but for breach. She rerouted her irrigation manually, knowing they'd likely target the automatic system first. She duplicated her legal records onto 2 encrypted drives and gave one to Susan, one to the watchdog rep. She updated every camera on the property, adjusted the angles to cover every blind spot, and placed clear signage at all 4 entry points stating the active injunction. She wasn't delusional. She knew signs didn't stop men with vehicles and orders, but signs made things admissible. She wasn't planning to scream. She was planning to document. The breach came at 6:17 a.m., 3 days after the letter. 2 white trucks, unmarked but bearing municipal plates, rolled up the gravel path and parked just outside her gate. 4 men exited, 2 in reflective vests, one holding a clipboard, the 4th with a tablet mounted on a shoulder strap. No uniforms, no badges, no visible tools. They didn't knock. They opened the gate. Melina watched through the upstairs window, already recording. She didn't move. Not yet. Let them cross. Let them misstep. The men walked 50 yards onto her land before the first one hesitated. He pointed at something, one of the laminated injunction notices stapled to a post near the greenhouse. A pause. A brief conversation. Then movement again, toward the well, toward the heart of the property. She descended the stairs slowly, every step deliberate, not rushing, not breathing too fast. When she opened the door and stepped onto the porch, they were close enough to hear her without shouting. "You're trespassing," she said, her voice low and even. "There's an injunction in place. You're in violation." The man with the tablet looked up. His expression was bland, unreadable. "We're executing a preliminary site inspection under Section 41. "No," Melina interrupted. "You're executing an illegal entry under the color of authority. That's not the same thing." Another man stepped forward, clearly the one in charge. He pulled a folder from under his arm and held it up like a shield. "This is a county order." "There's a state-level injunction superseding that order," she replied. "Filed 3 days ago. Delivered to the board's counsel and posted publicly. You're accountable for ignoring it. I suggest you reconsider your presence." For a moment, the silence returned, the kind that stretched, thinned, pulled tight like wire across a breach point. Then the man turned slightly, nodded at the others. They didn't speak. They just turned back toward the trucks. Melina didn't lower the camera. The trucks rolled out without incident, their tires spitting dust and authority into the morning air. She didn't celebrate. She didn't unclench her fists. She went back inside, backed up the footage, logged the encounter in her journal, and sent copies to Susan, the watchdog team, and the injunction court clerk. No assumptions, no delays. Every detail recorded, time-stamped, archived. 2 days later, the court ruled in her favor temporarily. The injunction held. The attempted enforcement was deemed procedurally invalid. A formal investigation was opened into the conduct of the board. It was a win. Not a cinematic victory, not a viral explosion of justice, but a hard, real legal halt. The kind that makes bureaucrats go silent for just long enough to feel the gravity shift. Still, Melina didn't relax. She knew it wasn't over. They'd pause, reassess, return with new paperwork, new angles, maybe new faces. Power doesn't retreat. It regroups. But the difference now was leverage. She had legal standing. She had documentation. And most importantly, she had allies who knew how to use systems the way the board had tried to. When she stood at the edge of her property that evening, watching the wind curl through the treetops, she didn't feel triumphant. She felt resolved. Not because she believed the worst was behind her, but because she finally understood what they were afraid of. Not guns. Not rage. Not protests. They were afraid of her composure, her method, her refusal to be rattled. She wasn't screaming. She was recording. And she wasn't asking for permission. She was demanding accountability. That was what they hadn't counted on. That was what they still didn't know how to stop. Weeks passed without letters, without trucks, without unmarked boots scraping gravel across the edge of her land. The silence didn't feel like peace, it felt like a recalibration, as if the pressure had momentarily receded, not because they'd given up, but because they were searching for a different shape to return in. Still, Melina used the time. Not to relax. That instinct had been trained out of her. She used it to fortify not with walls, but with paperwork, procedures, alliances, and layers of verification. The watchdog group delivered a full report within 12 days, a detailed analysis of the zoning manipulation, evidence of timeline backdating on the amended maps, and a list of correspondences between members of the board and a private development consultancy with a documented interest in the surrounding region. That consultancy specialized in land repurposing, specifically rural to residential transitions, masked as environmental preservation. Her land, it turned out, had been identified over a year ago as prime transitional acreage. Not because of anything it lacked, but because of what it represented: independence, inconsistency, unpredictability. In their view, she was a blank space on a coordinated grid. A glitch. Susan filed a motion for declaratory judgment in district court, demanding a formal ruling on the jurisdictional status of Melina's property and the limits of community board authority. The motion passed into review without challenge. The board's counsel missed the response window by 3 days deliberately, Susan believed, to avoid having to defend something they knew wouldn't survive scrutiny. Meanwhile, the state agriculture agency quietly withdrew their routine evaluation request, and the County Office of Property Standards closed the citation file without further contact. No apologies, no retractions, just vanished trails where bureaucratic teeth had once tried to bite. The land stayed quiet too. No new flags, no markers, no stickers. The damaged gate was repaired, the barbed wire on the southern edge reinforced with new posts, and the area where the animal remains had been dumped was now a controlled compost zone surrounded by thorn fencing. Melina walked the perimeter every evening, still not out of paranoia but out of habit. Vigilance, once learned, doesn't leave you. It becomes something else. A way of seeing, a way of owning. People began to speak again, slowly. The grocer nodded a little longer than usual when she passed through the checkout. A woman she barely knew from the feed co-op offered her a ride when Melina's truck was being serviced. No one talked about what had happened directly. But the tone had shifted. Whatever had been whispered about her in previous weeks, crazy, stubborn, difficult, had turned into something different. Private, cautious, maybe even respectful. And then, one morning, a letter arrived. Not from the board, from someone else, handwritten, unfolded carefully. It came from another landowner 2 miles north, someone she'd never met. It described eerily similar incidents, flags appearing overnight, strange inspections, non-responsiveness from the sheriff's office, power flickers, and sudden delays in deliveries. They had seen the injunction Melina filed. They had read the watchdog report, which had quietly circulated through certain legal circles. And now they were asking for advice. Melina didn't answer the letter right away. She sat with it for a few days, weighing the cost of involvement, the danger of becoming something more than just a landowner. But in the end, she wrote back. She shared her steps, her methods, her strategy. Not emotional, not heroic, just a map. A set of lines for someone else to walk, so they didn't have to stumble in the dark alone. Later that week, she was invited to speak informally, quietly at a small gathering of rural landowners hosted by the same legal advocates who had helped her. She went. Not for catharsis, not for revenge, but because the pattern was bigger than she had first understood, and her story was no longer just hers. It had become part of a resistance that didn't wear slogans or wave flags, but filed motions, documented process, and held firm when the pressure arrived masked in regulation. Back at the farm, the work resumed. The greenhouse needed resealing before winter. A new section of the pasture was being prepped for heirloom vegetables. Marge, ever stoic, had started to recognize the sound of the feed bucket before Melina even stepped off the porch. The rhythm returned. Not the same as before. Sharper, smarter, more aware. One afternoon, while installing a new gate sensor, she noticed something tucked beneath a nearby fence post of folded paper, waterlogged at the edges. No logo, no threat. Just 5 words, scrawled in faded ink. She didn't give it up. No name, no signature. She read it once, smiled faintly, and burned it in the fire pit. The land remained hers not by force, not by compromise, but because she had outlasted the assumption that she would break. And that was enough. She never stopped watching. But now she watched from a place of control, not defense. A boundary drawn not in fear but in proof. And for the first time in months, she stood at the edge of her porch, looked out across the fields, and let her shoulders drop not in surrender but in release. She had held the line, and they knew it.